Hello, everyone. I'm Andy Serwer, editor-in-chief of Yahoo Finance, and welcome to our fourth Election 2020 special presented to you in conjunction with HuffPost and Yahoo News. Tonight, the focus is on Black Lives Matter and the important changes that the movement for social justice has brought to society and this presidential campaign. I'm joined, as I've been each week, by my co-host, Yahoo News editor-in-chief Dan Kleidman, and HuffPost Washington Bureau Chief Amanda Turkel. Amanda, Dan, welcome.
Hey, Andy.
Thank you.
Amanda, good to see you guys again. Missed you.
We're getting used to this. Yeah. Dan, let me start off with you and ask you how important this issue has been for the campaign.
I think it's important. I mean, it's been important for the country, and it's been important in this election campaign on kind of two levels, I would say. First, there's the kind of more cosmic level, in a sense, the question of the impact that the racial justice protests and the focus on all of these issues of inequities have had on the way Americans see where we are right now. And, you know, we're in a campaign where the incumbent, Donald Trump, wants to be rehired. He doesn't want to be fired. And one of the things that everyone looks at when assessing an incumbent's chances are the question of, you know, is the country on the right track or on the wrong track? I think this very difficult past few months has, I think, suggested to a lot of people that in some fundamental ways we're on the wrong track. And those numbers are borne out in the polling that we've done and others have done. I mean, I think it's around 65% wrong track as opposed to right track. And I think that's hurt Donald Trump. And then you lay on top of that, you know, the pandemic and the economic fallout. And so that's made it very tough. And then very quickly, at the kind of tactical level, I think Donald Trump thought that this was going to help him, particularly because he was putting so much of a focus on some of the rioting and looting that we saw, and was trying to make the argument that he would be the law and order president. The problem was he thought that, you know, people in the suburbs, where elections are really fought out in a lot of ways, were going to be really terrified about what was going to happen. And he just doesn't, I think, fundamentally understand who lives in the suburbs these days and what people in the suburbs care about. And the polling suggests that a lot of voters who live in the suburbs are very concerned about racial inequities and want to get back to more harmony and less division in this country.
Thanks, Dan. And Amanda, Dan talked a little bit about how President Trump is framing the issue, I guess you could say. How is Joe Biden framing the issue on the other side? And how are African Americans responding, and will they vote, and who will they vote for?
Well, Joe Biden obviously is embracing the racial equality protests, and he has hit back and sort of been on the defensive a bit as Donald Trump is like, Joe Biden wants to defund the police. Biden is saying, no, I don't want to defund the police. And I will say that, you know, Biden has been making far less of an issue of this than Donald Trump has. You know, Donald Trump wants to talk about anything except the coronavirus. And so you saw over the summer that Trump was running quite a few ads about, he was running a lot of ads on China, but he was also running a lot of ads on crime and trying to say that, you know, look, Biden is very extreme, and if you elect him, you will see rioting and looting in your streets, and was being quite honestly, openly racist. I was going to sneeze there. Quite honestly, being openly racist, saying that people like Cory Booker, who is obviously a prominent black senator, will come in and, create housing projects and take over the suburbs. You know, black voters obviously aren't being won over by Donald Trump, but it seems like that this message isn't working with the sort of white suburban voters that Trump wants to win over as well.
And Dan, Amanda just said it's probably the case that most African Americans will vote for Joe Biden if they vote. But Donald Trump actually is counting on African Americans to a small degree to support him.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, elections these days tend to be one, about the margins, right? And they have tended to be fairly close, and so a percentage point here or there can make a difference. And I talked to people advising the Trump campaign over the last few months, and they have said that they really are, pushing to increase their support from black voters by just a few percentage points, and they think that would be part of their kind of path to victory. Trump did win about 8% of the black vote in 2016, which was an increase from Mitt Romney and John McCain 4 years before that. A couple of percentage points here and there. They wanted to get into the low teens, and I don't think that is likely to happen. But it is interesting that black men in particular have been more supportive of Trump than I think a lot of people would realize. And it's an interesting subject. It seems counterintuitive. But then again, no group is monolithic, and it's always possible to get, to go up a little bit or down a little bit every election cycle.
Amanda, how energized do you think African American voters are, and how important is that for a Biden victory?
We will see. I mean, it seems like Democratic African American voters are very energized, and the Biden campaign is aware that they need to make sure that these voters are energized in a way that in 2016 they weren't. And it seems like many people believe that the Hillary Clinton campaign took these voters for granted. Biden obviously does have a lot of African American support. That is how he won in South Carolina and how he became the nominee. Traditionally, he has had more support from older black voters than younger black voters. But you see the Biden campaign recognizing that this time we can't take the Democratic base for granted. We can't just focus on these other areas and these other groups. And so they are making an effort to make sure they reach out and they turn out these voters, as are outside Democratic groups, progressive groups doing this as well. So, I think that now Trump isn't just, a possibility and a threat. Trump is real. And I think that's motivating a lot of people on the left.
Right. Okay. Well, we're going to take a break, but when we come back, we'll be joined by Yahoo News national reporter Marquise Francis to discuss the black vote and voter enthusiasm ahead of the election. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Joining us now is Yahoo News national reporter Marquise Francis. Marquise, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
A lot of your reporting in recent months has been around different ways that the Black community has been engaged in this election and how the campaigns, especially the Democratic ones, are trying to engage back. What are you finding?
Yeah, well, one thing I'm seeing is the Joe Biden campaign, they're really trying to go where a lot of Black voters and a lot of Black people are. We know earlier this year, Joe Biden went on The Breakfast Club, which is a nationally syndicated radio morning show located in New York City. And he was interviewed by Charlamagne the God. Unfortunately, on that show, he kind of had the slip at the end where he said, "You're not Black if you don't vote for me." He's also doing things like they have these panels they're calling Shop Talk, kind of modeled similarly after LeBron's HBO show, The Shop, where they have Black voters, particularly prominent Black men, sit around in a barbershop type atmosphere, obviously more virtual in these times, and they talk about unfiltered conversation about debates. And I spoke to one of those panelists, rapper Young Jeezy, a few weeks ago, and he talked about why he's engaged. He didn't go as far as saying he would endorse Joe Biden, but he's saying he enjoys that the campaign is actually engaging with him. And this is a lot of the sentiment I'm hearing across the board. Now, all of their tries are not actually going necessarily well with Black voters. There was a video, I believe it came out last week, where they were simulating a rap battle of sorts, and they were throwing out campaign stats and different things like that. And that didn't really sit well with a lot of Black voters, but I heard you all talking in the first block just about Black voter participation, and they're really just trying to engage people. We know in 2016, I believe it was 98% of Black women voted for Hillary Clinton. But when you look at Black men, it was only 81%. So Black men are the group in which Biden definitely wants to ensure he kind of has the Black vote. And as Dan kind of mentioned, they are not a monolith. And we saw, even though the past few days, we saw rapper 50 Cent kind of come out and seemingly, not officially, but seemingly endorse Trump over, Biden's tax plans, which I think a lot of people are kind of misconstruing. But the Black vote is important, and we're seeing it. And for a lot of Black Americans, they just want to know that the things in which a presidential nominee says they will do, they will actually do.
Well, Marquise, let's dig into that a little bit, because you also had Ice Cube, the former rapper and movie star, flirt with Donald Trump, and the numbers are interesting. I mean, as we talked about before, they're still below double digits, but they're creeping up a bit. And Trump, who I think it's fair to say is the most racially divisive president we've had since Richard Nixon, or maybe even before, why is he able to attract more Black voters? And I'm particularly struck by, as you point out, male Black voters. I think I saw a number that he's close to around a 17% approval rate with male Black voters. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I saw a tweet, I believe this week, where it said Black men are actually more interested in fitting themselves where they fit into the patriarchy instead of actually dismantling it. And I think it just goes to the psyche of Black men. We all know as men, we have our own, just our own ways in which we do things, and our own biases, and even our own liberties at which we can live this world. And for Black men, oftentimes they may see themselves in a likeness of a Donald Trump, where he shows his strength and authority. I went to 5 Trump rallies actually over the past year and a half. And obviously the overwhelming majority of people attending these rallies were white men and women, but you definitely saw a handful of Black men. And a lot of them had the same sentiments of whether they were super conservative when it came to religion. Donald Trump is a Christian. He doesn't believe in gay rights. And we know the Black community, and specifically Black men, tend to be homophobic. But a lot of people tend to latch onto one thing, and they make that the only thing. We talked about 50 Cent just a minute ago. And one of the things that he kind of called out that he exclaimed was the tax bracket, which I believe once you make over $400,000, the money after that is taxed at about 65%. So it seems as though a lot of times Black men they serve their own interests when they're looking at the grand scheme of things. And Black women oftentimes are doing and choosing for the collective majority.
Marquise, so we talked a little bit right now about the gender gap in the Black community, but what about the age gap? Obviously, during the primary, Joe Biden got a lot more support from older Black voters than younger Black voters. Are those voters now coming behind Biden, or are they still not really quite as excited about him and maybe sitting it out a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but from what I understand, I think people are starting to more and more realize the importance of this election. In 2016, I was looking up a stat. For the first time in 20 years, Black voter turnout declined. It was at 59.6% compared to a record high in 2012, which was at 66.6, according to a Pew Research poll. And I've heard from so many people at one point, we don't like Biden, but we definitely don't like Trump. But I think it's becoming more reality. They're having to pick between the lesser of two evils for a lot of people. There are definitely going to be the faction of people who decide not to vote at all. They believe no one's good. It doesn't trickle down to them. But I think with the emergence of so many visuals, whether that mean commercials, we're seeing ads on Facebook, Twitter, people are really starting to realize how important their vote is. And we're seeing, even once again, going back to celebrities, I saw a video of Shaquille O'Neal voting for the first time, and Snoop Dogg. Personally, I have my own issues as a grown man over the 40 years old, you voting for the first time, but they're once again pushing out the need and the importance of voting. We even saw P. Diddy talk about wanting to start a new Black party. So there is just this increased fervor, this increased energy around this vote, everyone staying to vote. It's almost getting to the point where you're getting shamed if you don't vote. So I definitely believe young people understand the importance. From what I understand, most people are just going to say, you know what, we're going to go for Biden, we're going to go for Kamala. Kamala also being an HBCU grad from Howard University in DC. So there's things that even Kamala adding to the ticket kind of increase some enthusiasm within young Black voters for sure.
Well, Marquise, Joe Biden has talked about Black Lives Matter and those issues. And here's a clip of him talking about that recently. Let's take a listen.
If you say we have no need to face racial injustice in this country, you haven't opened your eyes to the truth of America today. There have been powerful voices for justice in recent weeks and months. George Floyd's 6-year-old daughter, who I met with, and when I met the family, Gina, I knelt down to say hi to her, and she said, looked at me and said, "Daddy changed the world." Jacob Blake's mother, another one, when I met with her, said, "Violence doesn't reflect who her son is, and the nation needs healing," and said she's praying for the police officers. Or Doc Rivers, the basketball coach, choking back tears when he said, quote, "We're the ones getting killed. We're the ones getting shot. We've been hung. It's amazing why we keep loving this country and this country doesn't love us back." Think about that. Think about what it takes to be a Black person to love America today. That is a deep love of this country that is far too long has not been fully recognized.
And I guess we could, kind of analyze how authentic that is or not. I mean, all politicians try to get their message across. But Marquise, you brought up Kamala Harris, and I wanted to sort of ask about that. You saw that big Kamala sign with Joe and Kamala, sort of equal billing, actually interesting. And how much is she going to really resonate with the Black community? You touched on that. Maybe you can drill down a little bit more.
Yeah, I think Kamala is honestly what Joe Biden needed. A lot of people have had conversations, about Joe's age, and we also know he has, I believe, a speaking impediment. But when you look at Kamala and her debate style, I mean, she gets right through the teeth of things. I think she held her own when it came to VP Pence, and we cannot discount what it means, the fact that we have an HBCU alum on this national ticket. HBCUs have been the pride and joy for a lot of Black America for so long. Before Black people could go to any school in the country, they had to go to our own schools. And they continue to be a part of just the Black community and the Black experience, whether that be fraternities and sororities. And once again, Kamala Harris being a part of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. And they are a huge international organization full of hundreds of thousands of women. So they're able to mobilize. And honestly, once again, with the snafus that Joe Biden seems to have almost seemingly every few weeks, Kamala seems to be the person there to kind of pick up the pieces in many ways. And I have to also point out that video you showed, when we think about even COVID-19, obviously we're in this international, this worldwide pandemic, and we see the crowds that the President Trump has versus Biden having this campaign rally where there's cars socially distanced and you hear cars honking in the background. And we know that COVID-19 disproportionately affects the Black community. I think it goes a long way in showing where our potential president for 2020, where their head is about how they care about the Black community.
All right, really interesting stuff. Thanks, Marquise.
Thank you.
Up next, we'll be joined by HuffPost reporter Jahan Jones to talk about race relations under President Trump. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Joining us now is HuffPost reporter Jahan Jones. Jahan, welcome.
How you doing? Thanks for having me.
You recently took a look back at how President Trump often turns to racist language when he feels threatened, going all the way back to the 1980s. Tell us about that and the impact on Black communities.
Sure. So I wrote that piece just to convey that this is, in Trump, a person who has continually shown an eagerness to draw from the well of white supremacy, throughout the entirety of his professional career and certainly well into his political career. Early in his professional career, you might be aware that he was accused of housing discrimination, not allowing Black renters to stay in his spaces. And then even more recently than that, when he took out the ad condemning what was then called the Central Park Five, he put out that ad during a time when he was experiencing effectively financial calamity, and he resorted to that as a means to heighten his profile, up his credibility. And so the point of that piece was just to convey that he's deploying a similar strategy with his political campaign. Obviously, at this time, the pandemic is ravaging the country, but he's continued to kind of tap that well of white supremacy. And the unfortunate thing for him is that we're living at a time of actual scarcity. The pandemic has made that glaringly obvious. and scarcity doesn't really comply with the promises of white supremacy, which is that every white man can have access to the American dream. You can live a middle-class life. You can acquire a refined education. All of those promises are becoming less and less realistic. All the while, Trump is leaning more heavily into that kind of rhetoric. So I think that's where you see some of the suburban white people have kind of cleaved from his support, because not necessarily because of his rhetoric, but because some of the promises that might have been afforded to people through white supremacy and white nationalism in the past are just becoming less and less realistic as a result of this pandemic that he cannot corral.
So Trump has said he's done more for the Black community than any president since Abraham Lincoln.
Yes, high self-praise.
I know you don't agree with that, but can you just, can you talk a little bit? I mean, has he been? What do you think? Has he been the worst president for the Black community since Abraham Lincoln? And sort of what is he doing when he's saying this? What is his strategy here? Because his campaign is cynically trying to make overtures, I think, to Black voters. Sort of what is he doing here?
Sure. I think to your point, there's a question as to whether those are really overtures to Black voters or whether they're demonstrations to white people that he's not as racist as others might think. I always think back to in 2016 when Trump revealed his Black platform on the tabloid media takeout. I thought of that as kind of a great exemplification of the seriousness with which he takes Black issues, that he would release it in this kind of haphazard way through a tabloid. That's where he thinks he's meeting Black people. And I think since then, you've seen this very unserious approach to garnering the Black vote. I mean, I don't know which rapper the Trump campaign is going to partner with next to kind of convey its message. But the reality is that Black people aren't going to be tricked into voting for a man who, in some very overt ways, has made clear he doesn't want Black people to vote. In 2016, he told Black people they have nothing to lose by staying home. In 2020, he is deploying upwards of $20 billion in lawsuits across the country to make voting more difficult, particularly in Black areas. So all of these overtures he's making, again, you have to wonder whether he's making those to Black people or whether he's making those to white people who want to feel as though they're supporting a man who's not as racist as everyone believes him to be.
Jahan, if there's a silver lining to this very difficult period that we've been living through over the last 6 or 8 months, it's that, in some ways, for all the wrong reasons, the country has come together to really focus on inequities, on social justice issues. To what extent do you think people in the Black community are concerned or should be concerned that if Joe Biden is elected, that some of the energy goes out of that movement because there's a sense that, now we have a Democrat who's committed to these issues. A little bit of I think about what happened when Barack Obama was elected, that a lot of people could say, we've elected a Black president, and it's the end of racism, it clearly wasn't. So, is there concern in the Black community about that?
Yes, and I actually don't think that concern is tied at all to Joe Biden winning. I saw a survey fairly recently that said a lot of the gains that were achieved as a result of the George Floyd protests with regard to anti-racist advocacy have regressed, meaning the support for Black Lives Matter that we saw so heavily in the immediate wake of George Floyd's death has kind of dissipated in the time since. So I think that concern about apathy toward racism is just this ever-present concern that looms over Black people. Certainly, there's concern among more progressive Black people that if a Democrat is elected, the people who live in this society who have been experiencing Trump for the last 4 years would believe that that was some sort of accomplishment and kind of take their foot off the gas. But I think the circumstances right now are so dire that once Joe Biden is elected, there's going to be so much work to be done for years to come that he won't be allowed to rest on his laurels, so to speak.
All right, Jahan Jones, thank you so much for that insight.
I appreciate you.
Up next, Yahoo Finance reporter Sabeel Marcellus on the coronavirus recession and how it's impacting communities of color. Welcome back. Joining us now is Yahoo Finance reporter Sabeel Marcellus. Hey, Sabeel.
Hey, Andy. How's it going?
Good. Thanks for joining us. You've been reporting on the push for more government stimulus and the recession. How is this different than economic downturns of years past?
Well, we're seeing, specifically when it comes to Black workers, they're being disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus pandemic, not just from a health point. They're being impacted there too, but also from a workplace standpoint. They're more likely to be exposed to the coronavirus, more likely to also lose their jobs as a result of the pandemic. And as we know, many workers, once they lose their jobs, they also lose their healthcare coverage. So I've been taking a close look at the unemployment rate. We've seen it come down to 7.9% in September. When you look at the unemployment rate for minorities, it remains elevated in the double digits. So we're seeing there's still a lot that needs to be addressed in terms of really supporting the Black community as we undergo this pandemic. Now, this is not to say that there weren't issues in the workplace in corporate America prior to the pandemic, but we've only seen it get a lot worse as a result of the pandemic.
Sabeel, I wonder how, to what extent Congress considers racial inequities when it crafts stimulus legislation like this. I mean, John F. Kennedy said that rising tide lifts all boats, and so I guess the question is, do we have to, and has the Congress been more race conscious when putting together legislation? I think about some of the disparities in just receiving, stimulus help. I mean, there are a lot of people in the communities of color that are unbanked, and so they don't have direct deposit, for example. If their earnings are fairly low, they don't file for taxes, which means that they have to do other paperwork. I just wondered how much those kinds of issues are taken into account.
That's a really important question, Dan, and that's something that lawmakers really have to address, because we're seeing Washington, when they're dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, they're taking a one-size-fits-all approach. So obviously they're doing the Paycheck Protection Program, small business loans to help all Americans who are being impacted by the pandemic. But the question is, how do you help minority businesses that are facing possibly more severe impacts? Because prior to the pandemic, it was much harder for them, when you look at the data, to even secure a loan to launch a small business. So the few that were able to do it, those numbers now to be hit with the coronavirus pandemic. And then when we're looking at who was able to secure one of those Paycheck Protection Program loans, when you look at the data, you see that minority businesses were challenged in being able to secure those loans. So because of that, many of them had to close shop permanently. And for those that were able to secure a loan, they're actually grouped in with actually all small businesses that are impacted, because they need another round of loans. They're asking for more help. So when it comes to addressing specifically racial equity in stimulus financial relief for the entire country, we're seeing lawmakers basically focus on everybody, but we're seeing a difference when it comes to Joe Biden's campaign. So I just spoke not too long ago with the chief of staff of Kamala Harris, Karine Jean-Pierre, and what she was saying is that Biden, in his administration, he would take a different approach, where he would look at systemic racism and have that color their perspectives and their actions when it comes to legislation. So if they're able to accomplish that in the Biden administration, if Joe Biden were to be elected, then we could possibly see a different approach from Washington when it comes to offering financial relief and addressing different issues in the workplace for Americans and for minorities.
Sabeel, you mentioned that you spoke with Karine Jean-Pierre recently about stimulus and more specifically Kamala Harris and the campaign. So we have a clip of that. So let's go and listen to that right now.
Look, we have to meet this moment. And that's what Joe Biden and Kamala Harris believe in, is meeting the moment and actually engaging the Black community and having that real conversation that's needed to be had. Joe Biden says this all the time. You know, we're talking about systemic racism, and it affects and it permeates throughout our society, throughout everything, right? Whether it's healthcare, as we're seeing over and over again. And look, so yes, we have to figure out how we deal with criminal justice reform. We also have to figure out as well how systemic racism deals in every part, every way.
Sabeel, so how do you think that message, how well do you think that message is resonating with Black voters?
So when Biden was doing his search for a vice presidential candidate, he said that it was going to be a woman. But although Kamala Harris was a front runner, the question was, well, she was her state's top cop as district attorney for San Francisco. Now, we've seen the protests of recent months. Would she really be the right person to really address social justice issues? And we're seeing that obviously Biden picked her. She made history as his vice presidential pick. And moving forward, we're going to have to see, obviously, the campaign is going to make a lot of promises, as do all campaigns trying to win. But we're going to see the difference, really, if they get the chance, if Americans give them the chance to be in the White House, how they would address these issues differently.
And so we've talked about the political world, but how is the corporate world and workplaces, how are they responding to these Black Lives Matter protests, these racial equality protests? You know, I see lots of nice ads saying that they support racial justice, but is the corporate world and our workplaces actually making meaningful, lasting changes to address systemic racism?
So we saw, as a result of the protests following the death of George Floyd, corporate America have this moment where it seems like their eyes were opened up and they really wanted to help their Black workers. So we saw a lot of promises about diversity in the workplace and promotions for Black workers and more hiring of Black workers and more training. And we heard those promises, but at this point, we're holding them accountable. So Americans are watching what companies promised what and what have they actually delivered. And that really comes to those who are at the top of the companies. You can't expect a Black worker who maybe is at the bottom of the ladder to really be able to implement change across the company. So we're really focusing on, when it comes to Americans looking at these companies and their promises, at what's happening in the C-suite, what's happening with the CEOs, the people who actually are in charge and can affect change. Are they actually doing it? And we're seeing some actually fall in hot water just trying to meet those diversity goals. I wrote a story recently about Wells Fargo's CEO, and what he was trying to do is, over the summer, in June, he made some comments that were considered controversial by some employees within his company, some Black workers, because he was saying there was a limited Black talent pool, which can be very offensive to Black workers who feel like they have the talent. And the issue is not a question of talent, but a question of opportunity. I also spoke to a Brookings Institution expert who said that there's this tired narrative out there when Black workers are seeking opportunities to say, oh, well, there's a skill gap, go train, go get more skills. And what this Brookings Institution report is saying is that there's actually an opportunity gap. And it's important for CEOs and the C-suite to really address the opportunity gap to really help Black workers and minority workers.
All right, great stuff. Thanks so much for joining us, Sabeel.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Andy.
Straight ahead, DeRay McKesson, one of the most prominent leaders of the Black Lives Matters movement. He joins us next. All right, we're delighted now to be joined by DeRay McKesson. DeRay has been a central player in the Black Lives Matter movement since he left his job in the Minneapolis public school system and moved to St. Louis to work for change in Ferguson following the death of Michael Brown. DeRay, great to see you.
It's good to see you too. It's been a while.
It has. So let me start off by asking you just how energized you think African Americans are when it comes to voting in the election this year, and to what extent they're going to vote for Joe Biden, and to what extent are some of them going to vote for Donald Trump?
Yeah, so I think that there are a lot of people who know exactly what's at stake, that we have barely survived these last 4 years of what's going on under Trump, and that we want to make sure that these next 4 years are ones that we don't just survive, but that we thrive in. Now, it is disconcerting. There are about 18% of Black men under the age of 50 that do support Trump, which has been shocking. I talked to a pollster about it yesterday, and what he said that I thought was really interesting, he was like, for this subgroup of people, Trump's racism alone is not actually a disqualifier, because they would say the whole system's racist, but it's the impact of his racism that's actually a disqualifier. So it's the impact. It's like telling people about the kids in cages and seeking the death penalty for drug dealers. All those things actually become a disqualifier for Trump. So telling that story, especially as we get down, and I think that what Trump has done effectively to the left is he actually isn't even attacking Biden all that much in his ads. He's actually attacking the party. He's saying the party's corrupt. The party doesn't care about you. Why are people believing him? I don't know, but it unfortunately is effective.
So, DeRay, I wanted to talk to you about some of the down ballot races and sort of what the racial justice protests, what room you think that they have given Black candidates to run. There are 6 Black Senate candidates this cycle, 5 on the Democratic side, 1 on the Republican side. A lot of them are long shots, but some of them are getting quite a bit of attention. Jamie Harrison in South Carolina, the Reverend Raphael Warnock in Georgia.
Warnock's doing well.
Yeah, Harrison and Graham are very close right now. And I talked to Mike Espy in Mississippi, who obviously ran before, and he said, and last time he ran, he took some heat because political commentators noted that he wasn't really talking about race. I talked to him this time, and he said that he is talking about race. He's telling his story because he felt like last time he couldn't connect with younger voters without talking about the discrimination he faced, the segregation in schools, and that this time is just different. So how do you think that the racial justice movements have created more room for Black candidates to run? And how is this different than, say, 2016 and sort of the political discussions about race?
Yeah, think about in 2014, it was still a newer conversation to be had in public at the national level. That in 2014, I even think about the police. It was like, people thought we were the wild kids for being like, the police shouldn't kill people. I mean, that was like a radical thing that we said out in the street. And it took people a lot of time to like learn and listen and read. By the time the protests reemerged this time, people were ready. People were like, okay, got it. There's a problem. Let me know what I can do. That it wasn't a jarring idea, that the idea of activism wasn't new. After Ferguson comes the Women's March, comes the March for Our Lives kid, like activism starts to become sort of just like a part of the culture. It wasn't the case in 2014. We were still the fringe kids. And I think that that's actually really powerful. I think that Cori Bush in St. Louis, I think that there are a host of candidates who, if not for this moment was like a galvanizing thing that like made people put their values at the ballot box. And I think that we will continue to benefit from that. What's hard is that like, it won't be enough just to win the presidency. We will have to win the Senate, gotta win it. So I'm hoping that we will get a wave of votes like we did in the midterms, where like the Dems knocked it out of the park, hoping that that'll happen again. And you're right, there are 6 Black candidates. John James has got to lose, the one Republican candidate. There's an interview he just did where he's like, he doesn't even know the answer to the question about healthcare. He is not a friend of issues related to Black people, and I am hoping that the guy running against him wins.
DeRay, you're talking about you're talking about Blacks running for elective office. But I want to ask you about, should Joe Biden win the presidency, I wonder if you think that there ought to be more representation from the sort of activist community in his administration. There'll be a lot of talk about the cabinet that he puts together, and Democrats have been more committed, I think, to racial diversity in their administrations than Republicans have traditionally. But I'm interested specifically in the activist community. If people like yourself, for example, would think that there may be an opportunity to bring reform from within, as opposed to staying outside of the administration. I mean, is this something that you would consider, for example?
Yeah, I don't know if that's where I'd best be suited, but there should be organizers, there should be activists who are on the inside. That part of our work is to make sure that we're not always fighting the people on the inside, that we are the people on the inside. I think the cabinet will be huge. I think that the cleanup after Trump will not only be massive, but it'll allow people's sense of possibility will be more expansive, because this has been such a nightmare that I'm hoping that the next set of people come in, that they do the most aggressive things in the first 100 days, right? That actually is like part of the strategy. So I'm hopeful about that. I also am mindful that the power to vote is three things, right? It's the power to hire, fire, and shape. So hiring is like get the right person in. Firing is get the wrong people out. But the third bucket is like get enough of the people who share our values in the room so that we're always represented.
Hey, DeRay, I remember you told me that in 2016, I believe you were supporting Bernie Sanders and he lost and Hillary got the nomination. And you said a lot of your friends said, I can't believe you're supporting Hillary, DeRay. You're betraying the cause. And then you said, well, Donald Trump means it. Now, a similar thing has sort of transpired this time. Maybe you were supporting Bernie, someone else. Biden gets the nod. Are you getting the same pushback from some of your friends who criticized you before for supporting Hillary when you're supporting Biden this time?
No, it's different. I think about even running for office in 2016. People were like, activists shouldn't run for office. You're a sellout for wanting to do it. Like now it's like, you look at AOC, you look at so many people have understood that we got to be on the inside. I think the pushback this time is I think that people are struggling with some of Biden's statements about the police. I think that people sort of take this phase as being like the end all be all, whereas I'm like, you know what? People put out campaign plans and then they get in office and we have so much room to push them. That's a part of the way that's a part of the way that the work works, that Biden won't be every position, right? He will be the person sort of outlining a framework and then there'll be a host of people in the administration who make it happen. And there'll probably be almost no holdovers from the Trump administration. So when I'm looking at this, I'm playing the long game. We have a lot of room to press. The attorney general will matter. The special assistants will matter. The cabinet, we have a lot of people to influence. It's not just Biden. And that's how I've always thought about this. So I do see some people saying, well, I see some people who don't know the terror that Trump has inflicted on people. And then I also see some people who sort of feed into the Republican narrative of like, they just want to arrest everybody. They just want to lock everybody up. And that's actually like a Trump narrative.
All right. Well, DeRay McKesson, so great to see you. Best of luck to you going forward.
Great to see y'all.
We'll be right back with some final thoughts from our panel. All right, welcome back. Before we go, Dan and Amanda, any final thoughts from you on the final 2 weeks of the election? What are we looking for here?
Oh my God, I don't know what's going to happen in the final 2 weeks. I didn't expect the president to get coronavirus. I think that the focus barring anything really weird, is going to continue to be on the coronavirus. Trump, again, has tried to change the topic several times. He tried to make it about crime. He tried to make it about China. And he tried to make it about the Supreme Court. None of those have really caught on. People are still focused on the coronavirus, on their economic well-being, and that is where it's going to stay as of now.
Dan, do you agree? And how important is the debate, for instance, coming up this week?
Typically the last debate is the least important. Now, there was only one other this time around, which I think was actually more consequential than debates tend to be, largely because Donald Trump did, I think, fairly disastrously and did not do anything at all to kind of bring a kind of closing argument to this campaign. If the question is, what's going to happen over the next 2 weeks, one thing I think, say fairly confidently is everyone's going to be freaking out over the next 2 weeks. I think Republican voters are going to be freaking out because they're looking at the numbers and it is looking like a potential landslide, and Democratic voters will be, those who are really paying close attention, that is, will be freaking out because there will be some tightening. There will be outlier polls that show it's closer than they realize. They'll be thinking about what happened in 2016, and no one is going to be resting comfortably between now and November 3rd.
Amanda, quick last question over to you. So you remember 4 years ago at this time, do we remember, did it really seem like Hillary Clinton had this thing in the bag? And is that the same sort of level that we have now with Joe Biden, and we were wrong?
Right. I mean, but also, what was it, 10 days out from the election, you had the James Comey bombshell. So again, anything could happen in these last 2 weeks, and you see Republicans desperately trying to throw out whatever they can on Hunter Biden. I don't know if there's going to be some bombshell. Right now, it's not catching on. But remember, too, the election is really perhaps only going to be the beginning of what could be a protracted court battle and counting and sort of waiting for these ballots to come in as both sides contest it.
All right, Amanda Turkel and Dan Kleiman, thanks very much.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.
And thank you all for watching. This is the last of these specials before Election Day, but stay tuned to Yahoo News, HuffPost, and Yahoo Finance every day between now and November 3rd for continuous coverage. And don't forget to tune in on Monday, October 26th for Yahoo Finance's All Market Summit.
Bipartisan Policy Center and Yahoo Finance for today's conversation about financial security and retirement savings. I'm Cara Watkins, the campaign manager of Funding Our Future, a coalition of over 40 organizations from leading academic and nonprofits to America's top corporations, all working together to make retirement security a reality for all Americans. You can check us out at fundingourfuture.us. The Bipartisan Policy Center and Yahoo Finance have partnered to bring you an election series with perspectives from both the right and the left focused on the critical economic issues facing our country. This is our final segment of the series in which we will examine how a Biden or a Trump administration would approach savings and retirement in 2021. Even prior to COVID-19, the Employee Benefit Research Institute projected that over 40% of US households were on track to run out of money in retirement. Surveys showed that roughly half of the population was already living paycheck to paycheck with almost no emergency savings on hand. Unfortunately, the pandemic and its economic fallout have put these kitchen table issues front and center for households across the country. Too many Americans are struggling to make ends meet and have heightened anxiety about their financial futures. Next year, with lingering economic pain, there is no doubt that leaders on both sides of the aisle will need to look at the short and long-term financial security solutions. So, what should Americans expect on retirement security in the next administration? What policies would help households both in this current crisis and withstand a future economic shock? And are there opportunities for bipartisan agreement? We hope today's discussion provides valuable insight into these two parties' savings and retirement security priorities. With that, let me turn it over to our moderator, Yahoo Finance's Adam Shapiro. Adam, please take it away.
Cara, thank you very much. I want to introduce you to the guests who are going to be talking about this issue. Joining us for this webinar are Alicia Manel, is the Peter F. Drucker Professor of Management Sciences at Boston College's Carroll School of Management, also serving as the Director of the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College. Before all of this, she spent 20 plus years at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, where she left as the Senior Vice President and Director of Research. Also joining us is Andrew Biggs. He is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, where he studies Social Security reform, state and local government pensions, and public sector pay and benefits. Before that, Biggs was the Principal Deputy Commissioner of the Social Security Administration, where he oversaw the administration's policy research efforts. I want to throw a question to both of you because you were debating this in the press, in the Wall Street Journal not too long ago. Something Cara said as we were getting into this. What if she's wrong? What if there's not a retirement crisis? Because there's a real debate as to, have we been approaching this incorrectly? Alicia, I'm going to start with you because I think you would say absolutely there's a crisis. So what more can you tell us?
So I think there's a crisis. If there's no crisis, then we can all go home and I would be more delighted than anybody else. Basically, no, older people were never rich. And over the last 10, 20 years, we've also seen an increase in the need for retirement income or retirement resources. And we've seen a decline in the amount of money available. And so basically, people are living longer. They are going to face high medical costs. And we now have a near zero rate of return. So they need a bigger pile. At the same time, Social Security, which is really the backbone of the system, is going to provide less relative to pre-retirement income because the full retirement age is increased. And then you have a big chunk taken out for your Medicare premium, and then increasing number of households are taxed on their Social Security benefits. So that's Social Security. On the other side, we have 401k plans, which I think work quite well for the top 40% of the population, but really don't provide very much for the bottom 60%. And so you add increasing retirement needs and reduced retirement income, and things look bad. And our sense is about half of today's working households are not going to be prepared for retirement, in the sense that they won't be able to maintain their standard of living in retirement.
But standards of living when we're older, we don't need as much. Andrew, are we perhaps all getting worked up over an issue that needs attention but not panic?
Panic, no panic.
Her if the crisis doesn't come to pass. I'd say I might be happier. I've staked quite a bit of research and my reputation on essentially the argument that this is a crisis that is overblown. Alicia's clearly right that if you go into the past, retirees were a disproportionately poor part of the population. If you look at more recent data from the IRS, they're today a disproportionately high income part of the population. Going into the COVID recession, retirement incomes were at the highest level ever. Poverty among retirees have been dropping. If you ask retirees, they'll tell you, 80% will tell Gallup, not simply we have enough to survive, but we have enough to live comfortably. Only 5 to 10% say they're really having problems. And then if you look at the level of retirement savings among working age Americans, we are saving much, much more for retirement than we did in the past. Compared to the days when traditional pensions were the norm, retirement savings today are 6 times higher relative to the size of the economy. More American households are saving for retirement than before. So it's if we don't have a crisis today, and we don't, and younger Americans are saving more than their parents or grandparents did, sure, we're going to live a bit longer, and I don't deny there are issues we need to deal with, but the idea that this is a crisis, of all the things the nation has to tackle, I just don't think the data really support it.
So Andrew, let me start this question to you, and we're going to talk about tax plans. President Trump, his plans for Social Security, and Mr. Biden's plans for Social Security. And Andrew, it is a fact that the Social Security Trust Fund will be able to provide, I think they're saying, about 70 cents on the dollar if we don't make any changes. In the not too far future, it used to be 2035, but given the pandemic, it might be sooner. Candidate Biden, Vice President Biden, has a plan to raise taxes on incomes of $400,000 or more as a way to shore up Social Security, and he would not remove the cap. But you had an aha moment in regards to that plan. What is it, and would his plan help save Social Security?
Well, Vice President Biden has a proposal to fix Social Security, and if you're in this game like Alicia and I are, you're happy to see anybody proposing anything on this. And so, I'm glad he has a plan out there. The crux of the plan is that he would impose the Social Security payroll tax on earnings above $400,000. Currently, the tax goes up to the first $137,000 you earn, and then it disappears. So he would impose the payroll tax on earnings above $400,000. You have this sort of donut hole in between on which sort of the upper middle class would not be taxed. The way the plan works, though, is that with every passing year, that donut hole shrinks. So eventually, all earnings would be taxed by Social Security. So it's not just the millionaires and billionaires, as some people would say. Eventually, the folks who are upper middle class folks but not rich, they're paying an extra 12.5% of their earnings to Social Security, and that puts the U.S. in a pretty high kind of tax environment. The second part of his plan is that about 2/3 of the new revenues Vice President Biden would raise by raising taxes, he doesn't dedicate that to fixing the solvency problem for Social Security. He dedicates to various ways of raising benefits. It's been kind of a call among many on the left to expand Social Security. He's gotten caught up in that. So what you have is a plan that essentially taps out higher earners on the tax end, only adds an extra 5 years to the trust fund. And so, I'm glad the conversation has started, but I certainly wouldn't want the conversation on Social Security reform to end with this, because I think it's not really a sufficient plan.
president's plan is to rely on 401ks, and we'll hit that in a second. But a colleague, an economist, Teresa Ghilarducci, along with Tony James in their book, Saving Retirement, points out that on the trajectory we're on before the pandemic, 25% of retirees will fall into poverty with Social Security. Social Security, I think, poverty level right now in the United States is around what, $15,000, $16,000 a year. So that even if you do the Biden plan, doesn't seem like we're going to be helping those people. What am I missing here?
A couple of things about the Biden plan. I agree with Andrew. It's a step in the right direction, but it doesn't take you at all where you need to be. And I'm surprised that the increase in revenues are so absorbed by benefit enhancements. They seem like very modest benefit enhancements to me. But one of them is to deal with people who have a lifetime of low income. So in that sense, it would help. But we need a proposal to really restore financial solvency to Social Security over the long run. And that takes a significant increase in revenues on the revenue side, or if you're going to do it on the benefit side, which I would not want to do, it means big cut in benefits. So there are proposals around the Social Security 2100 Act actually tries to cover the entire financing shortfall. And so that's just the beginning of a conversation. I don't think, and it shows that the intent is to try to restore solvency, but it doesn't get you all the way there.
Alicia, should Social Security be the sole foundation of retirement for the majority of Americans? Because this is going to lead into a discussion about 401ks. Or do we need some kind of government guaranteed pension for everybody?
So it was never intended to be the sole source of support for people in old age. It was supposed to be a base upon which they would build with private savings. And that's the way it works for people in the upper 40% of the income distribution. They have 401ks that they can use to augment their Social Security benefits. The problem is we really don't have something good for people at the lower end of the income scale, and we need one. And I really think that the coverage gap is probably the lack of universal employer provided or second tier savings is really one of the biggest problems in our retirement system.
So what would Andrew, what would that potential assistance for the lower income brackets, the bottom two quintiles, what would that look like? Because 401ks are only accessible to what, 50% of the population, and of that 50%, only 25% take part in them.
Well, I think this gets a little bit into the question of, how much do people need to save for retirement? There is this sort of tacit assumption that everyone should be saving for retirement at all points in their life. And if they're not, then there's some sort of problem. The reality is, if you look at, say, Congressional Budget Office data for the bottom third of the population, the poorest third of the population, they're going to receive a Social Security benefit equal to 75% or so of their average pre-retirement earnings. If those folks were to go to a financial planner, he's not going to tell them they need to save that much more for retirement. So it's, this isn't just a morality play. We want people to save just for its own sake. The financial planning and the Social Security benefit formula points towards those folks saving very little. The question, I think, is that the folks in the middle, the people who do need to save but may not have the opportunity to do it because they're not offered a 401k at work, because most people, they can use an IRA, but they just won't sign up for it. The states have done various policies, sort of auto enrollment IRAs for individuals who are not covered by a plan at work. I have some issues with those, but I think ultimately we need to get some sort of vehicle that is available to everyone, that follows the person from job to job. We have a very fragmented retirement system, even when it does work. So I think we need to rethink how all of this is going to work. I don't think we have enormous problems. Americans save a lot for retirement compared to other countries. We have very high retirement incomes compared to other countries. But we need to have a system that works for everybody so we have confidence in things.
Alicia, I think I saw you shaking your head in disagreement when I was asking that question to Andrew. So please correct me, because you know far better than I do. But what do you think that perhaps new system should look like?
So I agree with Andrew on some things. I think both he and I have the same goals. We want people to have enough money for retirement. We don't want them to have too much money for retirement. But just as point of fact, he and I differ on how you measure how much money low-income people get from Social Security. And you'll turn off all your viewers. We don't need to do it, but I don't think low-income people are as well provided for as he does. In terms of this second tier, I think that we really need to think whether that should be employer based or not, or whether there should be sort of a system that covers everybody. I do think they need to be auto enrolled because nobody goes and signs up for a retirement plan, as Andrew said, with regard to the IRAs. And so I'm hopeful that in a new administration where we can think about retirement seriously, that eliminating the coverage gap and providing this extra tier will be a high priority issue.
So, Alicia, I'm curious about 401ks because I had the good fortune to speak with Ted Benna. He's a Jeopardy question, by the way, the guy who a lot of people attribute with understanding how to create the 401k system we all now live with. And he talks about what works and what doesn't when I spoke to him. But we have this notion that retirement in the 60s and 70s was some grand, period in our lives when it never was. There weren't pensions covering the majority of the public. How did people do it before the 1980s?
They used to die faster, which made it a little easier. No, it wasn't. I think we have all, or certainly I have been guilty of sort of thinking back on the defined benefit world as the golden age. It wasn't that much of a golden age. The problem with the 401k system is that for people who have constant coverage and who contribute all the time, they end up with a nice big pile. And so when Andrew says we're saving more, I think that the pile of savings is very large. The problem is it's all in the upper 40% of the income distribution. And that what we're really missing is, as Andrew said, the middle, but I'm also more concerned about sort of the bottom as well.
that would allow a 401k type vehicle or some kind of guaranteed vehicle, because a 401k is not guaranteed. You could lose it in your investments, to the lower quintiles without doing a wealth distribution from the upper income? Or do we have to do it that way?
I don't think people, to be frank, want a guaranteed retirement income vehicle. I mean, if they could get it for free, if somebody to give them the money, they would take it. But if you look at individuals who invest with their IRAs or 401ks, they have the option of a guaranteed investment vehicle. It's called U.S. Treasury bonds. Almost nobody invests all their money in very, very safe instruments, because that means they have to save more in order to get an adequate retirement income. They're trading off, risk versus contributions. When you look at state and local pensions, you can see it's extremely expensive to and very risky for the sponsor to offer guaranteed benefits to people. And that risk and cost doesn't go away just by shifting it around and using accounting. I mean, 401ks have their downsides. But the real upsides they have versus the traditional pensions that came before them is, first, more employers are willing to offer them. I think around 40% of private sector employees at their peak had a defined benefit plan. Today, we're looking at well over that in terms of participation. But second, unlike defined benefit plans, you have two parties contributing. Traditional pensions had just the employer. 401ks have both the employer generally and the employee. So that really accounts. I mean, the contributions to these plans as a percentage of wages are probably 2/3 higher today than they were in the 1970s. So there's a balance of these imperfections versus sort of the costs of trying to make it perfect. And often those costs mean the plans are not going to be as attractive to people, and they're going to carry a lot of risks for whoever is running the plan.
Alicia, as we get close to wrapping, I'm curious, because if the president is reelected, he's already proposed a plan that would cap the funding for Social Security in the form of a payroll tax cut that would put allegedly money back into people's pockets. Do you think this would ever happen? Would Congress ever say, okay?
So two things, just so you don't think there's no disagreement between Andrew and myself, is that I like the current level of Social Security benefits. And I realize there's a big financing gap, and I would try to make that financing gap, close that financing gap by raising revenues. And Andrew thinks that, I don't need to put words in his mouth, but I think that he would think there could be some compromise between revenues and cutting benefits and raising revenues. I don't want to cut benefits. So that's one important thing. In terms of the president, the current president, he has no plan. He has this silly idea that people don't have to pay their payroll tax, or some people don't have to pay their payroll tax in the last quarter, and then they can make it up in the first quarter of next year. And then maybe if he's reelected, he get rid of the payroll tax totally. That's not a plan. That's not a plan.
Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up by giving each of you a chance to tell us what you think the future looks like. You can pick a winning candidate and tell us what this discussion, whether it be Social Security, private retirement funding, what does it look like based on the candidate you think is going to win the election? I'll start with Andrew and we'll finish with Alicia.
Oh, I have no idea who's going to win the election. I suspect, Alicia's right. I mean, President Trump doesn't have a plan for Social Security. He has sort of an idea. The idea, to the degree, he's fleshed out at all, is essentially substitute sort of income tax or general revenue tax financing for the Social Security payroll tax. Now, as an idea, I think that's actually a good conversation starter, in the sense that you can, there are countries like Australia and New Zealand who fund their retirement plans using income tax revenues. What they do, though, is they fund a more limited safety net retirement plan. They wouldn't fund something at the size of Social Security. So, to my view, a much more progressive source of revenue for a more modestly sized Social Security program is something that could actually sort of move things ahead. But, Social Security in particular is something where a president has to be fully committed to it. I worked in the Bush White House. He was fully committed, and we still didn't get anything done. So unless it is a really top tier priority for President Trump or for President Biden, I don't see anything happening soon.
Alicia?
So Andrew, I'm surprised you said, I also don't know who's going to win the election. You're talking to economists here, but this is not our field. But if Biden wins, then I think that, well, first of all, something has to be done about Social Security. we can't just let it go, because as you alluded to, Adam, the trust fund is exhausted, whether 2030, a little earlier, a little bit later. We should get, and then benefits are cut automatically. We have to address it. And this idea of using some general revenues, I'm not opposed to it, but my rationale would be that they're part of the cost of the program is due to legacy costs from giving money away to the first generation of retirees. I'm not sure that's President Trump's rationale for it. So we need to fix Social Security. We need to have this second tier. I think the second tier thing, I think Andrew's right, is something where people could come together and actually design something that makes sense, that would help everybody. And we have the Brits who've gone ahead of us, and we can look over and see how they bring in small employers and how the saving by lower paid people have affected the other parts of their balance sheet. And so I think it'd be a fun thing. I want to work with Andrew for the next 4 years and get this done.
Sign us up.
Andrew Biggs. Oh, go ahead, Andrew.
I'm happy to do it. The retirement policy community is a very small one, so we're always happy to work with each other. This is super important stuff, both for the government in terms of its budget, but just for households. And people do worry about their own retirement security. So even if I personally in my spreadsheet don't see a crisis, you want to do something so people can worry about something else other than retirement. So I think there's some prospects certainly on the private side to think of how we make the system work better for people.
And perhaps we can have both of you come back to have a discussion about public pensions and some of the problems that the cities and states face in regards to that, as well as the Pension Guarantee Benefit Corporation. But unfortunately, I have to say thank you to Alicia Manel as well as Andrew Biggs. Good to have you here. Cara?
Thank you. Wow, Alicia, Andrew, and Adam, that was such a terrific conversation. As we wrap up at the Bipartisan Policy Center, we look for opportunities to make progress in critical policy areas. And I want to note in 2016, a BPC commission released a report that focused on just that, the retirement security and personal savings issues, outlining a comprehensive package of bipartisan solutions to address these key challenges. So some of these proposals were incorporated in recent legislation, but plenty of work, including Social Security, remains. So to learn more about our work, visit bipartisanpolicy.org. After the election, BPC will host a virtual policy summit during the second week of December. In partnership with Prudential Financial and broadcast on Yahoo Finance, we will explore the critical topic of retirement and financial security through the lens of the workplace. On behalf of BPC and Yahoo Finance, thank you all for joining us. You can find the prior events in our election series on finance.yahoo.com. Stay well and take care.